A flight attendant checks the cabin and finds a man sitting in a seat that doesn't exist on the manifest. When she reports it, the passenger count starts changing by itself, and new seats begin appearing inside the plane. Everyone else keeps sleeping. Only she can see the cabin being rewritten around them. Then her tablet locks the final number, and the empty seat behind her lights up. This flight never crashes. Instead, it runs out of space. A flight attendant notices a seat that doesn't exist, and the moment she reports it, the plane starts making room for something else. Stay with me, because what this aircraft is hiding is worse than a crash. At 35,000 feet, Flight 772 was quiet in the way only long-haul flights are: dim lights, soft engine hum, and strangers breathing in the dark. Mara, the senior flight attendant, was checking seat numbers against the cabin screen when something small stopped her cold. Seat 23B was occupied. But on her tablet, 23B was empty. She looked up again. A man sat there, perfectly still. No headphones. No phone. No tray. Just his hands folded on his lap, eyes open, staring straight ahead. Mara smiled automatically. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The man didn't move. She tried again, closer this time. Still nothing. Not even a blink. Her radio crackled in her ear. "Cabin crew, confirm all passengers are seated for turbulence." Mara whispered into the mic, her voice tightening. "Control. I have a passenger in 23B that isn't on the manifest." A pause. Then the purser replied, slow and confused. "That seat has been empty since boarding." Mara felt the air in her lungs turn thin, because the man in 23B suddenly turned his head toward her, and quietly said, "You shouldn't be able to see me yet." Mara froze in the aisle. "You shouldn't be able to see me yet." The words didn't sound threatening. They sounded factual. "Sir," she whispered, forcing training into her voice, "I need you to come with me." The man slowly stood up. As he did, the overhead light above 23B flickered and died. Mara stepped back to give him space. But something was wrong. The aisle behind him looked longer. Too long. Rows of seats stretched farther than the aircraft layout in her head. The exit sign that should have been 3 rows away now hovered deep in the distance, dim and trembling. Her tablet buzzed in her hand. Cabin map error. Refreshing. The screen glitched. Seat numbers rearranged themselves. 23A. 23C. 23D. No 23B. She lifted her eyes. The man was no longer beside her. He was sitting again, in a row that hadn't been there before. A whole extra row, wedged impossibly between 23 and 24. Passengers around it slept peacefully, heads tilted, mouths open, completely unaware that an impossible row had grown inside the aircraft. Mara tapped her radio, her fingers shaking. "Flight deck, do you show an additional row in the cabin?" The captain answered after a long, careful pause. "There is no space in this aircraft for another row." The man leaned forward. "Not on your version of it." Mara backed into the galley, her heartbeat punching against her ribs. The cabin behind her was calm. Too calm. Coffee cups rested on tray tables. A baby slept against its mother's chest. Nothing about the passengers suggested they were sitting beside a row that should not exist. She grabbed the interphone and called the cockpit. "Captain, I think the cabin layout is changing." Silence. Then the first officer answered instead. "Confirm what you're seeing." "There's an extra row between 23 and 24. A man is seated there. He spoke to me. He knew I could see him." Another pause. Low voices whispered on the other end of the line. "Then, Mara, we never finished the cabin check." Her stomach dropped. What do you mean? The first officer swallowed loudly into the mic. We made the welcome announcement. We armed the doors. We pushed back. A soft, careful breath. But according to our system, the passenger count never locked. Mara's eyes slid to the cabin screen above the galley. Passengers on board, 189, 190, 189, 190. The number flickered like a dying light. Her radio hissed. The man's voice filled her headset. You keep waiting for an announcement, he said gently. There won't be one, Mara whispered, barely audible. Why? Because every announcement is for the living. The headset slipped from Mara's ear and clattered onto the galley counter. Every announcement is for the living. The words kept replaying in her skull. She forced herself back into the aisle. The impossible row was still there. Passengers on either side slept, slumped peacefully, as if nothing had changed. But the space between the seat backs in that extra row felt wider, deeper, like it had been stretched. The man sat in the middle, waiting. Mara took one step toward him. The cabin temperature dropped. Not enough to trigger an alert. Enough to make her breath turn sharp. What are you? She asked. He smiled for the first time. A door. He stood and gestured behind him, where the rear service door should have been. There was only darkness. Not a shadow. Not an unlit corner. A perfectly shaped absence, carved into the cabin wall, outlined exactly like an aircraft door. No handle. No markings. Just depth. Slow, distant pressure thumped against the fuselage, like something enormous brushing past the aircraft from the outside. Mara's ears popped. The lights dimmed across the cabin. One by one. Row by row. Stopping at the impossible row. The man whispered, close enough now that she could smell cold metal on his breath. This flight doesn't crash. Her hands trembled. Then what happens? He tilted his head toward the dark opening. It arrives. Mara didn't look at the darkness. She looked at the people. A teenage boy hugged his backpack to his chest. A woman slept with her hand still wrapped around a plastic cup. A man near the window stared at the seat in front of him, eyes open, but unfocused, like a paused video. None of them felt real anymore. Her tablet vibrated violently in her hand. Passengers on board, 190, 191, 190, 192. The numbers climbed, then dropped, then climbed again. Mara. The captain's voice broke through her headset, thin with panic. We're losing altitude data. The altimeter just went blank. She turned back to the impossible row. Another seat was now occupied. A woman sat beside the man. Mara knew her. It took half a second for the memory to hit. She had served her coffee earlier. Same face. Same sweater. The real woman still slept 3 rows ahead. Mara's mouth went dry. You're copying them. The man shook his head gently. Not copying. He gestured to the second woman. Receiving. The dark opening behind the row pulsed once, like a slow breath. The new woman lifted her head. Her eyes were wrong. Not empty. Finished. The man leaned close to Mara's ear. When the count reaches the number the aircraft can't hold. Mara whispered. What happens? The lights over the impossible row shut off. All at once. We stop pretending the cabin is closed. The captain's voice suddenly exploded over the cabin speakers. Cabin crew, take your seats immediately. The words were sharp. Wrong. There was no reason. No turbulence alert. No warning chime. Just fear. Mara stood frozen beside the impossible row. The darkness behind it widened. Not by tearing. By unfolding. The air bent toward it. Loose napkins slid across tray tables. A plastic cup tipped and rolled backward, against the slope of the aisle. Toward the dark. Mara. The man spoke her name like it had always belonged to him. You still think this is about the plane? Another seat filled. Then another. People appeared without walking in. Without opening doors. They were simply there. Each one identical to a living passenger somewhere else in the cabin. The count on her tablet screamed upward. 195. 198. 201. She pressed the interphone again. Captain, we are not losing altitude. Her voice cracked. We're losing a space. The aircraft groaned. Not metal fatigue. Compression. Like something gently squeezing a sealed container. A woman in the impossible row suddenly gasped. The real one, 3 rows forward, sat straight up at the same time. Both opened their mouths together. Only one of them screamed. The man finally looked worried. When the last seat is received, he whispered, the cabin becomes a corridor. The dark opening rippled. Mara felt it tug at her uniform, at her skin, at the shape of her, and somewhere deep inside the aircraft, a soft, polite chime rang. The seatbelt sign turned on. The seatbelt sign glowed above Mara's head. Click, click, click. All across the cabin, buckles snapped shut, one after another, without hands touching them. Passengers blinked in confusion. Some laughed nervously. One man muttered, "Did we hit turbulence?" The impossible row was almost full now. The dark opening behind it had sharpened. Edges formed. A frame. It really was becoming a door. Mara backed away. Her heel struck something solid. A seat. She turned. There was no aisle behind her anymore. Just another row. Fresh. Uncreased. Unused. The man watched her with quiet sympathy. You don't need to be afraid, he said. You were always on the list. Her tablet vibrated one last time. Passengers on board, 218. The number locked. Green. Final. Mara shook her head violently. No. I'm crew. He smiled. So were the others. She finally noticed them. Standing inside the dark frame. Wearing old uniforms. Different airlines. Different decades. Their faces were calm. Empty of urgency. Empty of resistance. A gentle recorded voice filled the cabin. Not from the speakers. From everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached our final configuration. The man gestured to the new seat behind her. Your seat is assigned, Mara. The floor softened. Not collapsing. Opening. Just enough for her shoes to sink in. The door behind the impossible row opened. Inward. Mara grabbed the armrest. It felt warm. Human warm. The new seat behind her was already labeled. 23B. Her stomach dropped. That seat was empty, she whispered. The man shook his head. It was reserved. The corridor beyond the door had finished forming. It looked like the aircraft aisle, but longer. Perfectly straight. Perfectly narrow. Perfectly endless. The crew in old uniforms stepped forward together. Not walking. Gliding. Their shoes never lifted from the floor. As they passed her, each of them lightly brushed her shoulder. And with every touch, a memory slipped out of her. Not her life. Her job. The drills. The commands. The muscle memory of emergencies. It peeled away like thin paper. The recorded voice spoke again. We thank our operating crew for preparing the cabin. Mara's hands slid off the armrest. Her fingers no longer knew what to do with it. Passengers stared blankly ahead. Their seatbelts held. Their world stayed small. Their world stayed closed. Only the impossible row remained open. The man stood beside 23B. Kind. Almost gentle. "You're not being taken," he said. "You're being repositioned." She felt the floor tilt, not down, sideways, toward the corridor, toward the place where flights that never crash are sent instead. The lights over the living cabin brightened. The lights inside the corridor turned on, one by one, leading away. He offered her his hand. Final approach. Mara didn't take his hand. It took her. The aisle slid. Not fast. Not violent. Like a conveyor belt hidden beneath the carpet. Her shoes drifted over the threshold of the impossible row. The living cabin stayed exactly where it was. Sealed. Finished. Behind her, a child laughed at something on a screen. A man coughed. Someone pressed a call button that no longer rang anywhere she could hear. The corridor swallowed sound. The door closed without a sound. Not a slam. Not a seal. An agreement. The man walked beside her now. They moved the way the aircraft pretends to move through clouds, smooth, effortless, false. At intervals along the corridor, seats appeared. Occupied. Each one held a crew member. Some wore uniforms so old the logos had faded into thread. Some were still in modern colors. All of them faced forward. All of them waited. Mara's reflection slid along the narrow wall. Her badge was still clipped to her chest. Her name still read. Mara Velasco, cabin crew. The man finally stopped. A final seat waited at the far end. Perfectly aligned. The only empty one. He gestured. Remembering flickered in her eyes. Not her life. Not her family. Only the first day she learned how to smile through fear. "How long do we stay?" she whispered. He smiled gently. "Until the next cabin needs space." The seatbelt light turned on above her. "Here." Mara sat. The seat shaped itself around her before she could change her mind. Click. The belt closed on its own. Not tight. Correct. The corridor did not move. It didn't need to. The aircraft world beyond it kept sliding past, unaware that a second cabin now ran alongside it, perfectly aligned, perfectly hidden. The man stood where the aisle should end. No door behind him now. No dark edge. Only more corridor. Only more seats. "You were good at keeping people calm," he said quietly. Mara tried to answer. Her throat produced nothing useful. A soft tone sounded above her. Not an alarm. A request. One of the seats farther down the corridor lit up. A new one. Empty. Waiting. She understood. The way you understand a safety card after the 10th flight. Another aircraft. Another full cabin. Another moment when space would be needed. "What happens to them?" she whispered. "To the passengers." The man considered. "They arrive." A thin vibration passed through the corridor. Not turbulence. Alignment. Far away, very far away, a real cabin light flickered. Somewhere, a flight attendant would look down at a tablet and see a seat that should be empty. The new seat beside Mara brightened. Her hand lifted. Not because she wanted it to. Because the job still fit. She pressed the invisible interphone and waited for someone to notice. This is why some flights arrive safely, but never with the same people who took off. If this story gave you chills, tap follow and share it, because the next empty seat you see on a plane might not be empty at all.